In a nationally televised Senate hearing, Jasmine Crockett stares down Mike Pence as he defends a $12 billion border wall, while 27 million Americans remain uninsured and hospitals shut their doors. Emotions explode as Crockett unveils leaked budget cuts, shows a dying child's photo, and asks a question that silences the room and splits the nation. Under the blinding Capitol lights, it's not just policy on trial, it's America's soul. Two leaders, two futures, one nation held hostage by its own priorities. If we can afford walls to keep people out, why are we letting our own citizens die inside them? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blinding rotunda lights of the U.S. Capitol, every camera locked in place, every seat in the hearing chamber filled to the brim, not with idle spectators, but with the power brokers of a fractured nation. A cold hush rolled over the room as former Vice President Mike Pence stepped forward, crisp navy suit pressed like doctrine, silver tie gleaming like polished steel. He carried a thick black binder labeled Border Security 2030, embossed in gold. $12 billion worth of concrete, steel, surveillance drones, and a doctrine he believed would save the republic. His face bore no uncertainty. This was his crusade, his moment to lead the nation back to God and order, as he once told donors behind closed doors. As he took his seat at the center table, the seal of the United States gleamed behind him like a halo cast in authority. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett sat silent, but her silence burned. No scripted speech, no entourage, just a worn folder in her lap, filled with names of those who died waiting for care. Her eyes locked on Pence, not with hatred, but with the sharp focus of a surgeon before a cut. She knew this wasn't just about numbers. It was about the soul of the nation. Pence came to build a wall. She came to tear one down, the invisible one that let the sick die quietly while Congress called it order. She came to tear down the wall, but first she had to let him build it, brick by brick, with numbers, fear, and the thunder of moral certainty. Mike Pence leaned forward into the microphone, his fingertips touching as if in prayer, eyes narrowing with practiced gravity. "This is not just steel and concrete," he began, his voice calm but heavy, like a sermon delivered at the edge of a grave. "This wall, this initiative, is a moral line in the sand." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room like dust. "It is a barrier against chaos, against the fentanyl that's murdering our children, the human traffickers exploiting our women, and the foreign agents who walk in without a second glance." Then came the paper, smooth, white, presented like sacred text. He held it up with both hands, the seal of Homeland Security gleaming in the corner. 38% of fentanyl, he said slowly, each word deliberate, entered the United States through our southern border just last year. Gas moved through the chamber, not spontaneous but orchestrated, a performance of alarm. A senator beside him leaned back, arms crossed in agreement. Behind him, aides scribbled notes, already preparing sound bites for the 6 o'clock news. Pence nodded solemnly, as if sealing the moral case. "What kind of nation," he continued, "watches its youth die and chooses to do nothing?" He didn't look at Jasmine Crockett. Not yet, but his words were aimed like a missile. He was building a fortress of righteousness and laying its foundation in blood and statistics. And still across the table, Jasmine didn't flinch. Not because the number wasn't horrifying. It was, but because she knew what he wasn't saying. That most of that fentanyl came not from desperate migrants crossing deserts, but from ports, trucks, and legal checkpoints the wall would never touch. But Pence wasn't here to dissect complexity. He was here to declare war. And in his war, steel was salvation, and silence was complicity. He wasn't here to dissect complexity. He was here to declare war. And now he reached for the weapon that silences most rooms, a grieving American family. Pence tilted his head solemnly and raised his hand, signaling to the aides behind him. The monitors flickered, then settled on a still image, a living room frozen in loss. A middle-aged couple sat shoulder to shoulder on a worn beige sofa, their hands interlocked but trembling. The father, a former Navy man by the look of his faded sleeve tattoo, stared straight ahead, eyes glassed over. The mother clutched a framed photo of a teenage boy in graduation robes, smiling wide, frozen in the moment before everything shattered. A small urn sat on the coffee table, its brass edges catching the light like accusation. "This is the Collins family," Pence said, letting the name hover in the air like it carried divine weight. They lost their only son, Jacob, to a drunk driving accident caused by an undocumented immigrant, someone who had been deported not once but twice, someone who should have never been here. He stood still for a beat, letting the silence deepen like a held breath. "They don't want revenge," he continued softly. "They want justice. They want us to mean what we say when we claim this is a nation of laws." His voice tightened, not with emotion, but with calculation. "And so I ask, if we can spend billions on foreign wars, why can't we spend a fraction of that to protect the families inside our own borders?" The image lingered, the boy's smile now a ghostly counterpoint to the stillness in the room. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the harshest critics didn't dare interrupt grief when wrapped in the flag. The camera panned to Jasmine Crockett. She hadn't touched her microphone. Her hands rested quietly on the worn folder in her lap. Still, but her knuckles were white. Her gaze didn't waver. The room wasn't quiet out of respect. It was quiet because something was shifting, because behind those eyes something fierce and calculated was beginning to turn. She wasn't untouched by the pain on the screen, but she could see what Pence was doing and what was missing. And in that silence, she wasn't mourning. She was measuring the weight of the story he had chosen against the thousands he had left out. She had let him speak, let him weaponize grief and statistics, let him lay each brick of his moral fortress with polished certainty, while the chamber sat still, hypnotized by a single boy's death. But Jasmine Crockett knew silence was not surrender. Silence was strategy, and when she finally stood, it wasn't with fury, it was with purpose, the kind of quiet that storms gather before lightning strikes. The chair behind her shifted back with a soft scrape, the only sound in the marble echo of the Capitol hearing room. She didn't glance at the cameras. She didn't look to the press row or the aides scribbling behind Pence. She looked only at him, at the man who had just made a wall sound like salvation. And then, with deliberate calm, she spoke. "You built a wall to keep people out," she began, each syllable shaped like a scalpel. "But who's going to build a wall to keep our conscience from collapsing in on itself?" Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried with it something far more potent than volume: moral clarity. The words dropped into the silence like stones in still water, sending ripples through every row. Pence blinked but didn't move. The chairman shifted slightly in his seat. And then Jasmine turned, not dramatically, not for effect, and tapped her finger on the touchscreen in front of her. The main screen behind her blinked once, twice, then came alive, not with a flag, not with a grieving family framed in patriotic lighting, but with something raw, something no strategist would ever show. A grainy photo of a hallway inside St. Andrews County Hospital in East Texas. The camera angle was crooked, as if taken by someone too tired to hold their phone straight. The fluorescent lights above buzzed in frozen motion, some of them dim or flickering. Along the hallway were bodies, not dead, but exhausted, slumped, waiting. A woman in a faded t-shirt held a limp child to her chest, rocking slightly. Beside her, a man sat with his head tilted back, eyes closed, holding a bloodied cloth to his side. Nurses moved between them like ghosts, their scrubs wrinkled, shoes worn, expressions hollow. "This is what's happening right now," Jasmine said, still calm. "Not on the border, not in some distant war zone. Right here, in our country, in my state." She tapped again. The photo changed. Now it was a waiting room, if you could call it that. Children asleep on cold tile floors, a sign on the wall. "Next available appointment, 9 hours minimum." One nurse behind the reception glass, answering phones with one hand while filling prescriptions with the other. "This is not a disaster caused by foreign criminals," Jasmine continued, her eyes never leaving Pence. "This is the disaster caused by neglect, by indifference, by the conscious political decision, to fund steel instead of stitches. Her voice grew tighter, like a rope being drawn across the chest. We're spending $12 billion to build a wall that won't stop a virus, won't treat asthma, won't revive a child whose lungs have filled with fluid while waiting on a bench outside an ER. She let that image sit, let it burn. And then she said it, the sentence that felt like it cracked the marble under their feet. In the United States of America, you can die of pneumonia because you don't have a plastic card in your wallet, and that is perfectly legal. No one dared interrupt her. The sentence didn't echo. It just hung there, pulsing, like a fire alarm no one knew how to silence. She didn't blink. She didn't sit. She let the gravity of it settle like a verdict. Then she turned back to the image on the screen. That little girl in the photo, her name was Alina, 6 years old. She died 2 weeks after this photo was taken. Not from anything exotic, not from anything rare. She died from a condition treatable with $40 worth of antibiotics. But her mother didn't have insurance, and the clinic was full, and the ambulance took too long. She inhaled slowly, not dramatically but deliberately, as if the act of breathing itself was an act of restraint. "I wonder, Mr. Pence," she said, her voice low now, almost intimate, "how many Alinas it takes to build the foundation of your wall?" She didn't need applause. She didn't want it. What she wanted, what she had, was silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from politeness, but from impact. From the collective realization that something sacred had just been broken open in front of them. Behind her, the screen remained frozen on Alina's face, not smiling, not angelic, just tired. A little girl, feverish and waiting, caught between a broken system and a budget that called her expendable. A child who never made it into a speech or a campaign video or a primetime headline, but now finally into the record. And Jasmine Crockett stood there, not angry, not loud, but unshaken, because she knew the truth Pence had avoided. The wall he praised could never save a child like Alina, and no amount of steel could shield a government from the consequences of abandoning its own. Alina's image still hovered on the screen like a ghost that refused to leave, her wide, glassy eyes staring into the chamber's collective conscience. The silence she left behind was not the kind that invited comfort. It demanded reckoning. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless for a moment longer, allowing the weight of one child's death to sink into the marble and minds around her. But she wasn't here just to mourn. She was here to indict. Without breaking eye contact with the panel, she reached into her leather folder and retrieved a stack of papers, edges dog-eared, sections underlined in red, notes scrawled by hand in the margins. She lifted the first page into view like it was a weapon forged in truth. "Let's stop pretending this is just about tragedy," she said, her voice stripped of all softness. "Let's talk about decisions. Cold, calculated, printed on government letterhead decisions." She stepped toward the center of the dais, holding the document high enough for the cameras to catch every seal, every signature. "This is an internal budget allocation memo from the Office of Management and Budget, dated 3 months ago. It outlines $12.06 billion allocated for enhanced border infrastructure and operational security. That includes reinforced walls, sensor grids, tactical drones, and new detention facilities in Texas, Arizona, and California, all greenlit, all fast-tracked." She flipped to the second page. Her tone grew sharper. "And here, on line item 42, is a cut, a $1.2 billion slash from the Community Health Block Grant Program. Gone. Stripped from rural clinics, prenatal care, and vaccination outreach. The very programs that could have saved Alina, that could still save thousands like her." The hearing room grew tenser with every word, like the oxygen was slowly being pulled from the air. Jasmine's next step echoed on the marble floor as she walked the length of the bench, locking eyes with the senators seated before her. $12 billion for fences," she said, pausing with purpose. "But not a dime for the doctors trying to keep premature infants alive in underfunded county hospitals." She held up the report again and slapped it gently for emphasis. "A tenth of this border wall budget, just a tenth, could fully fund vaccine distribution for 500,000 unprotected American children. She let that number hang in the air, then said it again, slower, each syllable delivered like a verdict. 500,000 children. Her voice didn't shake, but it no longer needed to rise. It had dropped to a deeper register, a place of fury that didn't explode but carved through stone. And you chose steel. She turned back toward the projector, where Alina's photo still lingered. You call it national defense, she said, nodding slightly at Pence. I call it national betrayal. Her voice softened only for a moment, the way thunder does just before another bolt of lightning. Because this government didn't run out of money. It ran out of mercy. A hush fell again, but this time it trembled. Because numbers don't lie, and Crockett had just weaponized the truth in a way even the most seasoned spin doctors couldn't deflect. She had laid bare the ledger of priorities, and in its columns were bricks and barbed wire on one side, and the lifeless body of a 6-year-old girl on the other. She had just laid out the numbers like autopsy reports. Clinical, undeniable, devastating. The truth was bleeding across the chamber floor, but Pence wasn't ready to yield. He sat straighter in his seat, fixing his gaze forward, the weight of age and ideology bracing his spine like armor. His voice, when it came, was no longer calm. It was the steely cadence of a man clinging to a worldview crumbling beneath him. Without security, he declared, his hand tightening into a fist against the table, there is no nation. Without order, there is no future. His eyes didn't seek connection. They searched for control. Borders are not just lines. They are lifelines. They keep danger out so that we can build safety within, so that mothers can tuck in their children without fear of traffickers, cartels, or killers slipping through the cracks. He leaned in slightly, jaw clenched, emphasizing each syllable like the ticking of a countdown. A country that fails to defend its own perimeter cannot survive. That is not fear-mongering. That is history. His voice, now louder, filled the chamber like the clanging of a distant alarm. Without security, there is no America. For a moment, the room stood suspended, not because his words were new, but because they were spoken with the weight of legacy, of all the administrations that had stood before him invoking the same defense, the same righteous shield of law and order. Some nodded in approval, others sat stiff, unreadable. The tension had shifted again, like a fault line threatening to crack. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't glance at the chairman or the audience or the cameras. Her attention was fixed, laser sharp, on the man who had just tried to turn fear into virtue. And then, with devastating precision, she stepped forward and spoke. Her voice was quieter now. Not weak, but sharpened, like a blade honed over fire. You say without security, there is no America, she echoed, each word deliberate. But I say without doctors, there are no Americans. The sentence struck not with volume, but with gravity, a truth that fell like lead. What are you defending, Mr. Pence? A border? A flag? A set of coordinates on a map? She took another step, the sound of her heels like a judge approaching the bench. You speak of lifelines. Let me tell you what a real lifeline looks like. It's a Medicaid-funded clinic in a rural town where one nurse works 12-hour shifts to treat 300 patients a week. It's a pediatrician driving 40 miles to check on a child with a fever because the county has no hospital left. That's the line between life and death for millions, and your budget just erased it. Her voice didn't rise. It descended down into the marrow of the moment. You want to keep people out. I want to keep people alive. She turned slowly toward the full committee, meeting each gaze, daring them to flinch. Because a wall won't treat cancer, a drone won't deliver insulin, and no child has ever been saved by barbed wire. She returned her eyes to Pence, and with a final, devastating breath, she said, You can secure the perimeter all you want, but if you let the people inside rot, then you're not defending a country. You're preserving a corpse. And with that, the air collapsed into silence once more. Only this time, it wasn't the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of reckoning. The screen flared to life again, and this time the air in the hearing room shifted. It wasn't a high-production video, no campaign music, no polished narration. What appeared was raw, unfiltered, The kind of footage too real for press releases and too painful for prime time. Jasmine Crockett had queued up exactly 60 seconds of truth, captured by a trembling hand in a dying man's breath. The footage began with the view jerking wildly, the lens adjusting to fading daylight outside a small clinic in Montgomery, Alabama. The clinic doors were shut, their glass covered with paper signs fluttering slightly in the breeze. One of them read, "Permanently closed, funding terminated." Slumped on a rusted metal bench below it was Tyrell Mason, a 43-year-old warehouse worker, collapsed sideways, mouth agape, lungs heaving like a dying engine. His face was pale and wet with sweat, his lips cracked. In his hand was a paper bag stained with condensation. Inside it, a nearly empty inhaler and a bottle of expired prednisone. On his lap, crumpled and smeared with sweat, was a rejection letter from Medicaid. Coverage denied due to administrative delay. The voice behind the camera trembled. "Somebody help, please. He's not breathing right." The camera tilted slightly, catching the small figure of a girl kneeling beside the man's legs. Terrell's daughter. No older than 10, her knees scraped, her backpack still strapped to her shoulders. She was whispering, "Daddy! Daddy, wake up!" Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. Not yet. She just kept shaking his arm, trying to pull him upright, as if her tiny hands could reverse what the system had allowed to happen. There was no final frame, no conclusion, just the image freezing as Tyrell's body slumped further forward, his daughter's voice calling his name one last time, and then the screen went black. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. A few senators shifted in their seats, but most stared straight ahead, caught between horror and the knowledge that this wasn't a tragedy, it was a consequence. Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Her voice was low, but it carried like steel dragged across granite. That man, Tyrell Mason, lived 43 years in this country. He paid his taxes. He obeyed the laws. He showed up to work even when his lungs were failing him. She held up a printed photo of him, not from the video, but from a happier time, holding his daughter on his shoulders at a county fair, both of them laughing, mouths wide with joy. He didn't need a wall. He needed a doctor. He needed a functioning clinic. He needed his government to prioritize his breath over your bricks. Her hand trembled slightly, not from nerves, but restraint. Terrell didn't die on a battlefield. He died in front of a locked door. A door that was closed because $1.2 billion was cut from the very programs meant to keep it open, while $12 billion went to build barriers hundreds of miles away. She turned to face Pence directly, locking eyes without hesitation. "You keep talking about invaders, but what invaded Terrell's life wasn't a stranger crossing a border. It was bureaucracy. It was abandonment. It was the kind of legislative cowardice that lets a father die 5 feet from help, because he filled out the wrong form." Then came the line, spoken not for soundbite, but like a eulogy. "Your wall may keep people out, but it didn't stop death from walking straight past it, into a man's lungs, and stealing him from his daughter while she knelt beside him." And the screen behind her remained dark, because nothing more needed to be shown. The truth had already done its job. It had made them look, and now it dared them to speak. The image of Tyrell and his daughter still hung in the minds of everyone in that chamber. But Pence, ever the tactician, moved swiftly to seize the moment and flip it on its head. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and leaned back into the microphone with a tone laced in gravity and subtle accusation. "Let us not lose sight," he said, "of the simple fact that a nation without strong borders is not a nation at all." His voice steadied, gaining traction like a sermon building toward judgment. "While I mourn every American lost to systemic flaws, we cannot, we must not, allow sympathy to dismantle security." He turned ever so slightly toward Jasmine without naming her, but the intent was clear. Some in this chamber would have us abandon enforcement, tear down protection, open every gate in the name of compassion. But compassion without structure is chaos, and no civilization in history has survived without protecting its perimeter. He paused, letting his words settle like a gavel strike. "This is not about cruelty. This is about continuity. There is no America if there are no borders. But before the applause could even find its rhythm, Jasmine leaned forward, not out of anger, but resolve sharpened into precision. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. Instead, she spoke as if delivering a quiet verdict in a courtroom that had just lied under oath. And there is no greatness in a country that lets its own people die quietly within those borders. Her gaze never wavered. You say a nation cannot survive without walls? I say it cannot call itself decent if those walls serve only to keep others out while the citizens inside bleed without help. Her voice pressed harder with each word, drawing the attention of every camera, every breath in the room. You talk about survival, but survival without dignity is not a nation. It's a fortress of denial wrapped in flags. Then she paused, and in the stillness, delivered the line that cracked like thunder. No nation worth defending lets its citizens die on its own soil. Not from invasion, but from indifference. And with that, the chamber didn't just fall silent. It braced itself. Because her words had made one thing undeniable. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was about who the nation was willing to protect and who it was willing to forget. The silence following her last sentence felt like something sacred had been broken. No one moved. Not because they were frozen in respect, but because they were cornered. Jasmine Crockett stood at the edge of that silence, not retreating, not basking in it, but using it. Her breath was measured, her grip on the folder tight. She hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. The tremble in the room now came from the weight of unspoken truths cracking under pressure. She took one slow step forward and placed the folder, in simple, gray, unmarked, on the table like it was evidence in a criminal trial. Her voice, when it came, was low but razor sharp. Since everyone in this room seems to agree that American lives matter, let's look at how we're treating them. She opened the folder and pulled a single sheet from the top. According to the Congressional Budget Office, as of this fiscal year, 27 million Americans live without health insurance. She let the number hang, her voice a scalpel. That's not an estimate. That's not partisan. That's a verified figure. Nearly 1 in 10 people in this country with zero access to affordable medical care. Not because they're lazy, not because they're undocumented, but because they can't afford to live here. She stepped to the center of the chamber now, walking slowly, deliberately, holding up the paper like it was a mirror. And do you know what that means in real terms? She asked. It means they're gambling with their lungs, their kidneys, their hearts, because a visit to the emergency room might cost more than their monthly rent. It means that a mother finds a lump in her breast and tells herself it's nothing, because getting it checked would mean losing her job and still not affording the treatment. She pulled another page from the folder and raised her voice just slightly, not to shout, but to cut through the dull hum of rising shame. 62% of all personal bankruptcies in this country are caused by medical debt. Let me say that again for the record. Not gambling, not drugs, not reckless spending, medical debt. She looked directly at the ranking members of the committee now, her tone hardened steel. People are going bankrupt trying to survive. They are selling their homes, draining their children's college funds, maxing out credit cards, not to get rich, but to stay alive. She paused just long enough to make sure no one could escape the gravity of the numbers. And then she went in for the pivot. Not a rhetorical trick, but a dismantling of the very premise Pence had staked his defense on. And since we're talking about what's killing Americans, she said, pulling out the final sheet of data, let's address the crisis this wall is supposedly being built to stop. Fentanyl. She didn't dramatize the word. She made it surgical. 80% of fentanyl seized in this country, she said, holding the page high, is not intercepted sneaking through remote deserts or river crossings. No, it's found at legal ports of entry, at highways, at commercial freight lines, at places where we already have officers, scanners, gates. She turned back toward the screen that had shown Tyrole's final moments in Eliana's locked hospital. So ask yourself, with all your talk of securing the border, is the wall actually doing that? Or is it just a monument to our misdirection? Her voice sharpened. Because the data says it isn't stopping the drugs. The data says it isn't protecting the people. and the budget says it's swallowing the very resources that could be. She placed all three papers side by side on the desk, like tombstones. 27 million without insurance, she repeated. 62% of bankruptcies caused by trying to stay alive. And the drugs? Coming right through the front door while we pour billions into locking the side gate. She let that sink in. No more words for a moment, just silence. And in that silence, the room began to shift. Not visibly, not dramatically, but something broke. A glance downward. A shuffle of papers that no longer seemed relevant. Even the stone-faced aide stopped typing, because this wasn't a speech anymore. It was a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't deliver a soundbite. She simply straightened the pages in front of her and finished the moment with a final blow wrapped in restraint. When a government builds walls faster than it builds clinics, she said softly, it isn't protecting its people. It's protecting its own conscience from having to look them in the eye. And with that, she stepped back. Not because she was done, but because the truth was. The numbers still echoed in the minds of every person in that chamber. Cold, factual indictments that stripped away rhetoric and exposed raw neglect. But Jasmine Crockett knew numbers weren't enough. Facts alone rarely pierced armor woven from ideology and self-preservation. She needed something more, something that couldn't be debated or deflected. She needed to force them to see themselves. With slow, deliberate motion, she reached beneath the open folder in front of her and withdrew a small, cloth-wrapped object. Her fingers moved methodically, unwrapping it as if revealing something sacred. A glint of silver caught the chamber's overhead lights. Gasps rippled in the back rows as members craned their necks, squinting to make sense of the polished rectangle now resting on the polished wood desk before her. It was a mirror, simple, clean, unapologetically direct. Jasmine didn't say a word at first. She just tilted it forward gently so that it caught the lights above and then slowly caught him. Mike Pence's face reflected clearly in the surface. The chamber stilled, breathless, as the symbolism began to land. First like a whisper, then like a thunderclap. She placed both hands flat on either side of the mirror and finally broke the silence. Her voice was low, but carried with the weight of a final judgment. Look into that, she said, not asking, commanding. You want to talk about security, about who's worth building walls for, about who we're defending this country against? But the face staring back at you isn't a cartel member, isn't a trafficker, isn't a shadow at the border. Her eyes locked with his, unwavering. The person you need to protect is already here. She let the words linger, like smoke coiling in still air. They come from Houston, she continued, voice tightening with emotion now. Not weakness, but steel pressed under heat. They come from Detroit, from Phoenix, from South Dallas, from Jackson, Mississippi, from the very streets that carry American flags on porches and stretchers on sidewalks, from the places where mothers are waiting 4 hours in a clinic hallway so their children can be seen for a fever. I know because my mother did the same for me. I sat there burning up while she paced with worry because there were too few doctors, too few nurses, too few resources, but plenty of excuses. The room sat motionless, eyes pinging between her and the mirror. They're not coming for our jobs, she said, her voice rising slightly. They're not climbing fences. They're already inside. They're working 2 shifts and still can't afford insulin. They're veterans rationing pills. They're children fainting in classrooms because their parents couldn't pay for an urgent care visit. They're not undocumented. They're undocumented by you, by a system that refuses to count them unless it's for a census or a headline. She stepped slightly to the side, letting the mirror take full center now, like a silent witness under oath. You built a wall to look outward, she said, but that mirror is your first wall that reflects inward. And what it's showing you, what it's showing all of us, is that the enemy isn't on the other side of a desert. It's inside these walls. It's the apathy that lets a man die on a bench outside a shuttered clinic. It's the politics that cut funding to rural hospitals but find billions for surveillance drones. It's the blindness that lets you build fortresses for a future threat while ignoring the people collapsing all around you. She turned back toward Pence now, her voice steady, controlled, but infused with quiet fire. You don't need another blueprint, Mr. Pence. You don't need another wall. You need to look at that reflection and ask yourself one question. Would you fight this hard if the people dying looked like you, lived in your neighborhood, attended your church? Her voice dropped into a whisper, but somehow grew louder in impact. Because that mirror doesn't lie. It just doesn't let you look away anymore. And then she stepped back. Not out of performance, not out of politeness, but because she had said everything she needed to say. The mirror remained silent, still, reflecting not just one man, but an entire system built on looking outward when the rot was already spreading from within. No one moved, not the staffers, not the senators, not even the cameras. It was as if the whole chamber had been turned into glass, suddenly confronted with its own reflection, unable to blink, unable to breathe, unable to deny the truth staring back at it. The mirror still sat on the table, untouched, its surface no longer just reflecting Pence's face, but echoing everything Jasmine Crockett had laid bare. For a full minute, no one moved. No rebuttals, no gavel strikes, just the heavy silence of a room that had run out of distractions. Then, breaking the tension with a controlled nod, the chairman leaned into his microphone. Given the intensity of the debate, he said carefully, this committee has authorized a real-time public consultation. We will now initiate a live vote through the Congressional Civic Response app. The results will appear on the chamber's main screen in 90 seconds. It was an unprecedented step, one that shifted the floor not back to the politicians, but to the people outside these walls, the ones who had no security escorts, no speechwriters, no microphones, but everything to lose. Screens around the room came alive with digital prompts. Which should Congress prioritize with the proposed discretionary budget? Two options pulsed on every device: expand border wall infrastructure or reinvest in public healthcare services. It was no longer a question for senators, pundits, or legacy. It was a question for the nation, and the nation was watching. For a few long seconds, the room was filled only with the quiet tapping of touchscreen responses and the low hum of anticipation from the press gallery. No one spoke. Even Pence, who moments earlier had thundered about survival, sat with his hands clasped tightly before him, eyes fixed on the floor. Jasmine remained standing, arms crossed, not triumphant, but resolute. She knew what this was. It wasn't a victory, it was a verdict. Then the lights dimmed slightly, and the screen at the front of the hearing room shifted. Bars began to rise in real time, percentages crawling upward like a live heartbeat. First in slow rhythm, then accelerating. 81%. Public health care investment. Gasps broke across the chamber like scattered applause. Audible, involuntary, disbelief and clarity merging in the same breath. 13%. Border wall expansion. And finally, in gray at the bottom, 6%. No opinion. No spin. No footnotes. Just the raw will of a nation suddenly choosing stethoscopes over steel. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply turned to the screen, allowing the numbers to fill the air where arguments had once lived. She didn't need to interpret them. They were self-evident. But the cameras did what cameras do. They searched the room for a face, a crack in the wall, and they found Pence. The lens tightened on him as he stared at the numbers, his expression neutral at first, then slowly tightening at the jaw. His lips pressed together, not in defiance but in calculation. He'd spent decades reading polls, but this wasn't a poll. This was a moment, a rupture, and he knew it, because there are arguments that collapse under facts, and then there are those that crumble under the weight of public conscience. The camera cut back to Jasmine. She met Pence's eyes, not with contempt, not with glee, but with the unwavering force of someone who had dragged the truth into daylight and watched it stand on its own. She didn't need to say another word. The entire room understood. The debate was over. The wall, so often framed as protection, had been reframed as neglect. One final number flickered on the screen, almost as an aftershock. 312,000 participants. 312,000 Americans, weighing in not as pundits, but as patients, parents, workers, and citizens. And 81% of them had chosen care over concrete. The silence that followed wasn't hollow. It was full, full of the reality that something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the bloodstream of the country watching. The hearing was still technically in session, but no one cared. No closing statements would change what had just happened, and no wall would ever feel the same again. The numbers still glowed on the screen above the chamber, hard, fixed, and now irrefutable. 81% for public health care, 13% for expanding the border wall, and 6% undecided. There was no applause yet, no celebration, just a dense, trembling silence hanging in the air like the moment before a dam breaks. Jasmine Crockett stood still at her desk, one hand resting lightly on the manila folder, the other beside the mirror she had placed earlier, like a quiet indictment. The reflection within it, simple and inescapable, had captured more than one face. It had captured the moment the argument ended and the reckoning began. The chairman didn't speak. No one did. For all their years in this building, for all the debates and votes and choreographed sound bites, this was not how these hearings usually concluded, and yet something about it felt inevitable. Jasmine knew that if she sat down now, the room would remain stuck in its own breathless suspension. Not because of what had been won, but because of what had been exposed. No policy had passed, no amendment ratified, but the truth had arrived. Undeniable, unrelenting. She stepped forward again. No script, no theatrics. Just a woman standing alone beneath the Great Seal of the United States, her voice clear, slow, and devastating. "I want to leave this chamber with a question," she said, the words low but slicing through the room like wire through silk. "Not a bill, not a headline, not a slogan or a soundbite. A question." She paused, letting the weight of her silence build tension. "Not as a tactic, but as a consequence. We've talked about numbers today," she continued, eyes scanning the committee dais. "We've talked about billions for concrete and razor wire. We've talked about fentanyl and fear and foreign threats. We've debated borders and security and sovereignty." She took another step, the sound of her heel echoing across the marble. "But we haven't talked about us. Not really. About what it means to call ourselves a nation when millions within that nation are invisible. When the richest country on earth is somehow the one where the poor die silently in waiting rooms, or in parking lots, or on cold benches outside shuttered clinics." Her voice sharpened now, not louder but heavier, like a blade turned flat and pressed slowly against the skin. "You say a wall keeps us safe. I say a wall is what we build when we no longer know how to care. You say it protects us. I say it divides us. Not just from the world, but from our reflection." She gestured to the mirror again, its polished surface still angled toward Pence, toward the cameras, toward all those watching at home. "That mirror doesn't show an enemy. It doesn't show a threat. It shows the people you've overlooked, the ones you said you were defending, but never heard, the ones who weren't foreign invaders, but your own citizens, your own neighbors, your own people, asking only to be seen." She pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder. Not data, not budget lines, but a photo. A child in a hospital gown, no more than 5 years old, clutching a teddy bear as oxygen tubes snaked beneath her nose. "This is Mia," she said, voice tightening. "She died waiting for a heart transplant. Her mother worked 2 jobs. Her insurance had lapsed by 10 days. That's all it took. 10 days. And a system more interested in checking forms than checking pulses." She turned the photo around so the committee could see. There was no border between Mia and safety, just a wall made of paper and policy. She placed the photo beside the mirror, letting the 2 symbols sit there in silence. "I have 1 sentence left," she said softly. And then she looked at Pence, not with contempt, not with victory, but with something far more dangerous to the architecture of indifference: clarity. If a child is dying and we still choose to build a wall, then what we need in this country is not fencing. What we need is a conscience. For 1 full second, there was nothing. No movement, no response. Just silence, thick and staggering. Then from the gallery above, a single person stood. They clapped once, then again, and the chamber followed. row by row, slowly rising from their seats, filling the room not with ceremony, but release. Staffers stood, journalists rose, even a few senators, reluctantly at first, then in quiet acknowledgement. The sound swelled, not like a cheer, but like a wave crashing against something ancient and hollow. Jasmine didn't move. She let it happen around her, never breaking the line of sight with the mirror in front of her. Because the applause wasn't for her. It was for the truth she had spoken aloud. The truth that had, for a moment, filled the room more completely than any budget ever could. And then the room fell still again. Not with fatigue, with reckoning. Jasmine stepped back once, then twice, allowing space for the silence to speak for itself. The mirror gleamed, the photo lay still, and the screen behind her, now dimmed, was no longer displaying numbers. Just the great seal of the United States, now oddly fragile beneath the weight of what had just been said. She turned back to the panel one last time. Her final words came not like a conclusion, but like the first tremor of a shift beneath the surface. We keep telling ourselves we're afraid of outsiders, but maybe what we're really afraid of is the truth about ourselves. It hit like a silent explosion, a line so quietly delivered, it felt as though the air itself had cracked open. No gavel struck. No one declared adjournment. The hearing, technically, was still in session, but everyone knew it was already over. Not because Jasmine had ended it, but because truth had. The chairman didn't speak. Pence didn't move. The cameras were still rolling, but there was nothing left to capture. Just one woman standing beneath the flag, beside a mirror, beside a photo of a child, in a room that no longer felt like it could lie to itself, at least not today. And far beyond the hearing, across kitchen tables and hospital break rooms, into phones and living rooms across the country, the question moved like wildfire. Are we protecting our borders, or just building walls to keep from seeing what we become? The mirror still sat on the table, untouched. The chamber was silent, not because the conversation was over, but because something deeper had cracked open and now refused to close. Jasmine Crockett stood at the eye of the storm she had summoned. Not with thunder, not with applause, but with a stillness more powerful than any outburst. And yet she knew, truth alone doesn't change a nation. Truth only starts the fire. To make it spread, she would have to light the match one more time. She stepped forward. Not for show, not to punctuate what had already been said, but because unfinished justice has a sound, and she was going to give it a voice. Her tone was quieter now, but sharper, more urgent, like glass underfoot. "Let me speak not to this chamber," she began, scanning the polished wood and the unmoved expressions of political ritual, "but to the people watching at home, not to the senators seated here, but to the ones in scrubs, behind steering wheels, holding second jobs, holding dying hands, to the people who don't have a seat in this room, but feel the decisions made here like they're pressing down on their chests." The silence shifted, deeper now, not out of tension, but out of gravity. She leaned slightly on the table, palms open. "You've been told you're powerless, that your pain is just an unfortunate side effect of complex policy, that your struggle isn't a crisis, just a calculation, that your child's missed vaccine, your mother's closed clinic, your father's unpaid hospital bill are sad stories, but not urgent. And you've been told that the only thing you can do is wait. Wait for the next vote. Wait for the next budget. Wait for them to remember you exist." Her voice rose now, not in volume, but in moral altitude. "But I need you to hear me. You do not have to wait another minute. You do not have to wait for permission to matter. You do not have to wait to fight for someone whose name will never appear in a press release." She stepped around the table, the mirror and the photo still beside her like sacred symbols. If your child is uninsured, make that their problem. Call their offices, show up at their fundraisers. Ask them why they paid for a drone but not for your inhaler. Ask them why they held a press conference about the border wall while your neighbor died in silence 3 blocks from the nearest clinic. She turned her body toward the camera. The invisible thousands, perhaps millions, watching through phones, televisions, streaming feeds. Don't let them tell you this issue is too complicated. You live the consequences. You know it's simple. People are dying, not from invasion, but from abandonment. And abandonment is a policy choice. Her eyes burned now, but not from rage, from clarity. Start where you are. If your child's school is running a food drive because too many students come to class hungry, speak up. If your local clinic shuts its doors 3 hours early because it's out of funding, don't just post about it. Write your mayor, write your governor, write your representative. Show up at their town halls with photos, not pleasantries. She stopped, let her breath sit in the room for a beat, then pressed on with more force. They're counting on your exhaustion. They're counting on your cynicism. They want you to believe that nothing can change, because that is how they keep everything the same. Her voice cracked, just slightly, but it made the words land harder. But every clinic reopened, every child vaccinated, every policy rewritten to include people like you, starts with one action they didn't see coming. She stepped forward, pointed directly to the screen above the committee's dais, the one that had earlier displayed the live vote. You already spoke once? 81%. You chose care over concrete. You chose life over fear. Don't stop now. Make that number echo beyond this hearing. She walked again, not pacing, but moving like someone preparing to launch something heavier than words. You may not have a PAC. You may not have a platform. You may not get invited to Capitol Hill. She paused. But you have a voice. You have a vote. You have a story. And that is enough to terrify them into action. Now her tone deepened, like thunder rolling low in a summer sky. Flood their offices, melt their inboxes, show up in numbers they can't ignore. Show up even when they try to push you to the back. Show up until their donors ask, who are these people and why aren't they going away? Show up until their pollsters whisper, if we don't address this, we lose. Her breath slowed again. She looked around the chamber, gaze calm but unrelenting. You don't win this fight with hashtags. You win it with disruption, with uncomfortable questions in quiet halls, with persistence in the face of polite deflection. You win it the way justice has always been won, by people who had no choice but to make themselves heard. And then she looked into the camera one last time, eyes steady, shoulders squared, not asking, not inviting, challenging. If you've ever sat in an ER wondering how long your child could hold on, if you've ever skipped a dose to make it to payday, if you've ever buried someone who should have lived because care came too late or not at all, then don't wait another day. She turned toward the committee again, letting her final words fall across both marble and memory. Don't just hope someone else will act. Be the interruption. Be the voice they didn't budget for. Be the vote they didn't see coming. Be the wall that justice climbs over, and the door that decency walks through. The silence that followed wasn't silence anymore. It was movement, not yet visible, but alive. A fire that had been lit not on a podium, but in kitchens, in crowded buses, in hospital corridors, in every place where injustice had been endured without recognition, until now. And somewhere, far beyond that hearing room, a mother picked up the phone. A father opened his inbox. A teacher printed flyers. A nurse walked out of her night shift and told her story to a local reporter. Not because someone had handed them permission, but because someone had reminded them of their power. Because Crockett hadn't just testified. She had called for reinforcements. And this time, the country was listening. The chamber still hummed with the residue of Jasmine's final declaration, but she wasn't done. Truth left untouched becomes ceremony, and today was no ceremony, it was confrontation. She stepped forward again, not for applause, not for comfort, but for combustion. Her voice, steady and razor-edged, came not as a plea but as a reckoning. Let me speak directly to those beyond these walls, the Americans who watch this hearing with clenched jaws and quiet rage. They're counting on you to move on. They think by tomorrow you'll be drowned in bills, distractions, exhaustion. But if you saw what I saw today, if you felt it, then this isn't the end. It's ignition. She took one step closer to the cameras, not invading, but inviting. Her voice was lower now, the kind of quiet that makes people lean in. You've been told your voice doesn't count, that your pain is inconvenient, That your kids miss surgery, your spouse's unpaid treatment, your own breathlessness waiting in a lobby too full to help, aren't crises, just data, just background noise. But let me say this with no ambiguity. You are not background. You are not marginal. You are the front line of every failed decision they signed with a smile. Her hands were open now, not in surrender, but in defiance, the gesture of someone offering not comfort, but command. This fight isn't waiting for permission, and neither should you. She turned, scanning the marble faces of lawmakers seated in expensive suits and practiced neutrality. Start where you are. Pick up the phone. Flood their lines until the voicemail system crashes. Show up at their town halls with stories, not slogans. Tell them the name of your child, the name of your pharmacist, the name of the nurse who cried beside you because the equipment you needed didn't arrive on time. She breathed once, not to pause but to center the flame. Turn their safe offices into confessionals. Make them look you in the eye and explain why the wall was worth more than your life. She pointed toward the screen where earlier the mirror had glinted under Capitol lights. Look again. The threat isn't coming from another country. It's coming from the policies that let hospitals close in your zip code, from the budgets that treated children's lungs as optional, from the silence that greets every death too poor to trend online. Her tone sharpened, voice like a match dragged across a national fuse. So let's talk about action, not hope. Action? You vote, yes, but you also speak. You organize, you write, you rally. You make sure your story is no longer background noise. It becomes the sound that shakes windows in places they thought were insulated. And when they tell you you're being too emotional, remind them, a child's last breath isn't polite. A parent choosing between chemo and rent isn't quiet. So neither are we. She leaned into the podium now, as if she were laying bricks made of rage and righteousness. You've already seen the numbers. You've seen the mirror. Now be the answer. Text 5 friends, email 10, post what happened here today, show them the image. Ask them, what do we do now? And don't stop until the answer comes with legislation, with funding, with actual healing. Not bandages, healing. Her voice turned again, deeper, softer, deadly clear. Don't let them shame you into silence. Shame is their last defense. It's what they use when they run out of logic. When they fear what happens if you stop whispering and start shouting. They are not afraid of your facts. They are afraid of your follow-through. So give them something to be afraid of. She raised her hand, pointing at no one and everyone. I want town halls filled. I want inboxes flooded. I want rallies in cities and suburbs, in the corners of the country they thought had already given up. Show up at campaign stops, at church meetings, at school board elections. Ask them why your tax dollars built steel, but couldn't buy your inhaler. Ask them why fentanyl is blamed on the border. When they know it's walked in through legal ports, they refuse to regulate. Jasmine's breathing was slow now, not because she was tired, but because the room was. The audience had gone from still to stirred. She didn't have to shout. The weight did the work. If you've ever held a child's hand and wondered if they'd survive the night, if you've skipped a dose so your parent could take theirs, if you've stood over a grave and wondered if one more appointment could have saved them, then this is your line in the sand. She pointed once more to the polished floor beneath her heels. This marble was laid by people who never got thanked, who never got care, who never got seen. We walk on their sacrifices. Don't let this moment end in echoes. Let it end in action. She stepped away from the mic and walked to the center of the chamber, facing the camera head on, one final time. No wall will save us from what we refuse to fix inside our own borders. No wall will shield us from the truth about who we failed. But you can be the wall that justice climbs over, the voice that pierces every excuse, the breath that revives this nation's conscience. Then she dropped her hand, as if lowering the gavel the chairman never would. Interrupt them. A pause. Interrupt everything. And just like that, the room was no longer just a place where power spoke. It was a place where power shifted, where watching wasn't enough, where Jasmine Crockett didn't just end a hearing, she began a movement. And every viewer who heard her last line would have to choose walk away or walk in. The hearing adjourned, but no one stood. The gavel fell, but it sounded more like an afterthought, a punctuation mark lost in the storm Jasmine had unleashed. Even Pence didn't move. His jaw clenched, eyes locked on the chamber floor, as if searching for an argument that had drowned somewhere between the mirror and the screen. Cameras zoomed out. The chairman shuffled his papers, but it felt mechanical, empty. Jasmine had not just spoken. She had detonated something, and now that fire was spilling past marble columns and velvet ropes. Outside the Capitol, a ripple began. Phones lit up across the country, notifications stacking like bricks in a wall Jasmine had commanded to fall. The hashtags were already trending. Wall of conscience, interrupt everything, not one more child. In Memphis, a nurse forwarded the clip to her union. In Tucson, a father showed it to his teenage son, his eyes welling as he whispered, "This is why I vote." In Akron, a college student stood up in a silent dorm lounge and said, "We should organize." The footage spread like lightning, not because it was loud, but because it was true. There was no viral gimmick, no shock joke clip. Just a woman in a Congress seat holding the nation's mirror and refusing to let anyone look away. By nightfall, a coalition of grassroots clinics across 5 states had launched a coordinated campaign titled, "Be the Flood." Their demand? Divert emergency funds from DHS's concrete contracts to pediatric ICU staffing. Meanwhile, political operatives scrambled behind closed doors. Polling firms were called at midnight. "Run that clip. What are we seeing in swing counties?" Governors issued prepared statements that read like damp paper. All caution, no courage. But it didn't matter. Jasmine hadn't spoken for headlines. She had spoken for a movement, and it wasn't waiting for permission anymore. In Houston, a mother printed her medical bill, $17,962 for her daughter's untreated seizure. She taped it to her front door. In Chicago, a pastor rewrote Sunday's sermon around Jasmine's closing line, "Interrupt everything." In West Virginia, a group of retired coal miners, each with worn hands and state insurance that barely covered prescriptions, called their local representative's office, not to ask, to demand. And far above it all, the Capitol dome stood silent, a relic of battles past, now witnessing the start of one not yet written in any law book, but etched in the pulse of the people rising below. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.